Hello there, welcome back to Reading Between the Lines. Today, we're going to be talking about something pretty cool. I was thinking about what it took to become a king and why we, for so long, accepted kings and why we have presidents instead of kings and how this entire social system kind of came together because it's the kings and the leaders and the people in charge that are the controllers that have so much effect on our lives and that can either make history, rewrite history, erase history. So I was kind of thinking about how this all started when I remembered, because this idea of the divine right of kings, this goes back as long as civilization goes back. In almost every culture, it's been an accepted thing. And that reminded me that I read this book one time, and this man, James, what's his name? Julian Jaynes, had a theory that explained this whole system. And I got to thinking about it. I was like, that's a pretty cool theory. I think I'm going to do a video on it, and that's what we're here doing. So I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but it's called the Bicameral Mind. It's the theories of Julian Jaynes, and the book actually, the first book he wrote, it was in 1977. It's called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And he was a Princeton professor. If you've ever seen the show Westworld, I know some of you probably have, many of you probably have not, but the idea was kind of introduced in that show. I think Anthony Hopkins mentioned it once or twice, but it was basically the idea that, well, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's this park, this amusement park full of very human-like robots that basically get abused by the people who go and visit the park. I mean, abused in so many ways, killed, used. I mean, I don't even want to get into it. It's pretty ugly. But the show is about some of the robots are starting to become conscious. They're starting to realize, be self-aware. And it's based on this idea of the bicameral mind. It's really a great show. The first couple seasons are good. The last season was pretty dumb, though. Anyway, so this guy, Julian Jaynes, he was a philosopher and a psychologist, and he, was at Princeton, and he was thinking about this idea of consciousness, and the idea of the Iliad came up to his head, right? He's just, how your brain goes all over the place, and things, you think of them for some reason. So he's thinking of the Iliad, and which is a very, very old poem, epic poem, written by we don't know really who. Just they call him Homer. It could be he also wrote the Odyssey, and the time periods were so different that Homer couldn't be the same person that wrote them both. But that's what it's attributed to, as Homer. But the Iliad is different than the Odyssey. And he talks about the language in the Iliad and how it's so much different than we talk about things today, or that we tell stories today. In the Iliad, the main character was always talked to by the gods, but he was commanded by the gods. In fact, he didn't do anything without the gods commanding him. He had no idea. He never said I. He had no idea. He didn't have a self-awareness, which isn't obvious at first, but once you go and read it, you realize that he didn't. It's the same kind of thing in the Old Testament, which is, we don't have a whole lot of ancient writings, really. We don't. Not that have been translated into a readable form. And the Old Testament is another one. And there's a lot of works in there, a lot of stuff in there where the people that are, the language is, and God says this and God says that, as if this person's a conduit to the God. Very little idea of self-awareness or the idea of I or anything. And he noticed that by the time the Odyssey was written, that had changed, that the language had changed. There was a lot more self-reflection. There was a lot of talk about how the character felt, how, emotions, and it wasn't so much like he was following commands as he was talking back to the gods that were talking to him. And he came up with this theory, okay? Now, it's pretty out there. It's pretty crazy. But by the time we're done with this video, I think you're really going to be kind of amazed by it. So this idea that he came up with is that human consciousness is something that's developed over time. Basically, that in ancient times, we thought differently. Our brains worked differently. Self-awareness and the idea of I am, of it's hard to describe it. Self-awareness is a good way to put it. But he says he thinks that only developed about 2,000 years ago, and he can show you how it's evident in the cultures. And I'll go through some of that with you. Before humans developed consciousness, we existed under a different mentality. And what he thinks is that we had verbal or audio hallucinations which directed our actions. That most people, the way that they went about the world, I know this sounds crazy, just bear with me, is that they went about the world on autopilot most times, kind of the way that we do, like when you're driving, you're not consciously all the time, you're not consciously turning the wheel or shifting gears or putting the brakes on, you just do it automatically. Or, when you react to something, you turn your head to a noise, you just do it automatically. He believes that that's mostly how humans existed. But when it came to major decisions, there was no consciousness, so it was like a dog, there was no like forward thinking, and that what we had developed or what we had started to evolve into was that one half of our brain would try to talk to the other half of the brain, and because at the time we were so underdeveloped, it took form with audio hallucinations. So the person would be like, what am I going to do today? Do I need to do something dramatic? Any big decisions would only happen when they would hear a voice in their head telling them, giving them commands to do things. I know this sounds crazy. I know it does, but at the end of this, you're gonna understand how it might make sense. So the hallucinations were a result of the bicameral mind, which is the two-chambered mind, which is because your mind has two hemispheres. I'll show you in a second. So it's actually been proven, the neurological model that he created for this has been matched up with new imaging studies done years after he developed this theory. He was a clinical psychologist, so he worked with a lot of people who were schizophrenic, people who heard things, people with brain damage. So his whole theory, basically, by the end of it, you'll see, it explains people, or, as a group, the macro, explains our relationships with our gods and later our kings. So like I was saying a second ago, our brain is in two hemispheres, right? See, this is a clear line of delineation right in the middle. Well, he thinks that this line was a big gap for a while. And nowadays, what has happened is it's been connected, okay? There's a lot more blood vessels that go back and forth that connect this part of the brain. He believes that it was barely connected, just a little bit, okay, in ancient, or, 2,000 years ago. And it makes sense. We still, if this is true, and he thinks that basically that has connected, the brain tissue, now our hemispheres have merged, then we still have vestiges of this in our world. For instance, we have a little person inside of our head that we call our conscience, that tells us the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. The devil on your shoulder, or the devil or the angel on your other shoulder. People still, you'd be amazed, people still hear voices. What he said is, he said about 11% of the population hears voices in their head that are not their own. It's not like when you're just thinking to yourself or when you're talking to yourself, but a voice in your head that is separate than you, thinks separately than you, and can talk to you as a different being in a way. 11% of people have that happen on a regular basis, and 85% of the population have had something like that happen to them, either episodically or occasionally. 85% at least have happened once or occasionally. He says that it tends to happen under stressful situations. Our art reflects this, right? That other picture you just saw was labeled The Voices in My Head. The name of this picture is The Voices in My Head. We have memes about it, right? We have jokes about it. We have articles about it. We have TED Talks about it. It's real. I actually, and he writes in the book, he has a couple of anecdotes about people that he knew, but he didn't write about his patients, but people that he knew that heard voices in their heads. And as some of you might actually have voices in your heads occasionally, it's not that uncommon. Some of you might know somebody who has experienced this phenomenon. I remember talking to a friend of mine, and she was telling me a story, and she says, you know how when the voices in your head tell you something? And I was blown away. I was like, no, actually I don't. But she thought it was common enough. She just thought it was something that people just didn't really talk about, until you were good friends. And I think that that's way more common than you'd think. Now, so in the Iliad, the character was a person who didn't act until the gods told him to act. Now, the Iliad is an epic poem, and he did act a lot, right? He wasn't somebody that sat on his couch, or whatever version of ancient couch is. He went forth into the world and he acted, but it was all on the commands of his God. This shows you how many times, or how many instances of direct divine moral contact or address that Apollo spoke to the main character or characters in the Iliad that caused them to act. This is a lot. Sometimes it was the gods were disguised as other people, or just would speak, like an animal, or something that doesn't usually speak. Sometimes it was the god themselves that was actually speaking, and the person recognized it as such. In ancient times, gods gave commands all the time. Here's an example of a god commanding somebody. In Christianity, God, in the Old Testament, God used to speak to people all the time. All the time. I mean, we have so many examples of it. From Adam and Eve, God spoke directly to Adam and Eve. God spoke to Noah. Now, you notice over the years, it's kind of a withdrawal, right? I'm going to use a lot of examples from the Christian and Hebrew tradition, because that's what I'm more familiar with than a lot of the other things. So forgive me if this is a little Christian heavy. It does apply across cultures. I just don't know as much about them, and so we're going to use a lot of the Christian examples. Anyway, so, in the beginning, God spoke directly to Adam and Eve. And then by the time it gets to Noah, God speaks to Noah, but he's not speaking to very many other people. I mean, he's becoming more withdrawn. By the time Moses comes, Moses has to go up onto the hill, to the mountain, to speak to God, right? But God will speak to Moses, but he doesn't do it. It's becoming even less direct. One time he spoke to him through the burning bush. And this time God's giving Moses commandments to pass on to the people in written form, right? So God used to speak to people. And that's not just Christian, that's across cultures. People would hear the gods. That's kind of what this theory kind of says, is that prayer evolved after people stopped hearing from the gods, and you would pray because you wanted the God's advice again. Now, he believes this kind of thing, it just evolved because consciousness, he believes, requires language. And there's a reason for that. And it's because language requires a development for metaphors. And that's just true. Like, you point to a rock, the word rock is a metaphor for rock, right? The only thing that isn't a metaphor for rock is when you pick up that rock and you're pointing to it, right? That's the only time when you're communicating, when you're not using metaphors. So as you begin to use language and you assign names and metaphors to things, what happens is, when you're telling stories or you're relating information, you start to make a concept of yourself. Like, if you're telling someone, I killed a bear, or he killed a bear, you have to differentiate from yourself and others, or what you did and what others did. So it's the beginning of the concept of I. And that leads to, that's abstract thinking when you're telling a story, because you're telling something that's not happening at the moment. as that develops through culture, once reading and writing and art and poetry and music, all of those things. But it usually starts with storytelling, and then and artwork on wall, the rock walls or whatever, and it goes from there. And that's just more development of the abstract in trying to make it more understandable. And as you do that, you develop more sophisticated metaphors, et cetera, et cetera. And again, what he thinks is that, and this is true, so for most people, except for left-handers, but we're just going to deal with the most right now, is the right hemisphere deals with language. And then in the left hemisphere, what he says is there's this whole exactly opposite of where the language part is in the right hemisphere. In the left hemisphere, it's just blank. It's not used really anymore, except sometimes. Now remember, he was a psychologist and he did a lot of studying the brain. And what he believes is I showed you, that gap between the hemispheres. He believes that in ancient times, there was just a little bit there's not a whole lot of connectivity right here. There was some blood vessels, but not a lot. And that over the years, we've developed more epigenetics and things like that. And what he says is, and this is really crazy, okay? So this was in the 70s. He read about experiments that were done with people who had brain damage. I don't remember if it was deliberate brain damage or not, but basically the connectivity that joins your brains together was cut. Okay, it just wasn't there. Somebody had come and cut it all through, probably trying to heal something or whatever. And what had ended up happening is it created this person was not able to have self-awareness in the same way anymore. The experiments that were done is the person was sat down and one half of her face was covered. Like she could only see from, she had like a divider. She could only see what one side of her body was doing. And the doctor would show him like two cards and ask her which one is red. And she would just say, I don't know. But her other hand would be picking up the red card. But she wouldn't know that her other hand was picking up the red card. And that just blew me away when I heard that. I was like, what? So he basically demonstrated that you can be of two minds, literally. And what he postulated was that the reason that these audio hallucinations developed was because there was such little connectivity between these two hemispheres, and that this hemisphere, the left hemisphere, deals with abstract ideas much more than the right-hand hemisphere does. And this is the language hemisphere. So in the process of converting these abstract ideas into language, or into being able to speak, actually, this is like the mode of being able to actually use your mouth and your vocal cords and everything. But in order to communicate those ideas, the best and most efficient way was to use language instead of sending the information the old-fashioned way, like through the nerve endings in the wires. So it was like a shortcut that our brains evolved, he thinks, in order to send information across to the other hemisphere. So that's why you would hear the commands instead of developing the idea that you made the commands yourself and then following through. It was like a shortcut way of transferring information and sharing your brain. It's crazy, I know, but I think it makes some sense. So basically what ended up happening is you had these God voices that would tell you what to do. They weren't separate from you, but you didn't know that. You didn't know they weren't separate from you. And this, she says, is proven by all of the idol worship that was done in ancient times, where they treated these physical things as if they were actually real gods that could hear them. And he says that maybe these gods, like they actually were hallucinating that these gods would hear them, especially if they're concentrating on it and they're thinking about this God. And that's kind of why the gods developed characteristics and personalities. Okay. And so as they're going through, the motions of oh gosh, this slide is the wrong order. So let me just catch you up real quick. So he says, that's why they had, in the Egypt times, that's why they had, they were preserving these corpses for the afterlife. And that's why they were giving them food in their tombs and riches, because they would have somebody, a king that they looked up to, that they felt like was giving them commands in their head, who died, and they were still hallucinating that these kings were talking to them. So that's why they took such care of them while after they died. And that's why these statues and these tombs and sarcophages were done, because they felt like they were still talking to these kings, right? And that's why it ended up being a worship thing, because they were always hearing them in their head. And that's where the divine right of kingship kind of evolved. So they went through these elaborate ceremonies, and it evolved into this. It first began that he said the archaeologist found the first king burial, tomb burial, and it was basically a king that they had propped up in a house and then sealed up over. So he thinks that they were just revisiting this king, coming and prostrating themselves to him after he died for the longest time, until they could find someone else who could take that place in their mind that they could assign these voices to. And that's where the sacrifices to the gods came from. They would sacrifice animals, food. This says they used to worship cats. So it's kind of likely that they thought their cats were talking to them in their head, and if you look at a cat and he's looking at you sideways and you're hearing voices, I could see that. So that goes on for years and years. And then, like I mentioned Moses earlier, as it evolves, and what happens, he thinks, is it was kind of an evolution. People would be, first they're just hearing direct voices, and then they're hearing them occasionally, and then they're trying to invoke them, and then eventually they become conscious. Now he says this happened not all at once. There were some people that became conscious when most people weren't, and that's where the idea of leadership came from. Leaders were emerging because they were becoming fully conscious, and they understood that the rest weren't. And so then that's how they became king, and people would follow them, right? So what's different about the Hebrews, and he mentions every culture kind of integrated this idea in a different way, in their own way. Sometimes it was violent, sometimes it was catastrophic. And what happened in the Christian world, and with this idea is, and this happened in other cultures too, is they began writing down commandments. There was one instance of workers in a field, and they had like wooden stones that were in the middle of the field that would tell them what to do, right? Tell them what they were doing, which direction, all things like that, because they would need continual reminder or reinforcement of what to do. And so it was advantageous for someone, or the kings, to take this role, because this was going to happen anyways, and it was better to assign it to a king or someone with good qualities that they could fixate on and direct people's activity. But as that went on, so this is an example of writing down the commandments. And then a little bit further after that, the Hebrews created the law, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it is a set of like 600 laws that basically told people how to live. And the idea is if you followed every one of these laws, that was to live a virtuous life. And the laws were weird. You'd think that they were all spiritual laws. They weren't. Like the first 1 through 20 and the last like 100 all have to do with listening to only Yahweh, no other gods, and no false idols. Okay, so this is the idea to get everybody unified, right? That's where monotheism came from. Now these laws, some of them were really like, okay, they were telling, it was like if you had a toddler, okay? You have to teach a toddler how to live in this world, right? So some of the laws had to do with cleanliness. Like for instance, one of them is that you need to wash your hands, and it says while reciting a prayer before meals. I see that kind of as like, how your kids, some people, they'll play a song, a 2-minute song while their kids brush their teeth. It's more like making sure that they wash their hands for long enough before a meal. But these people didn't know that washing your hands before eating was necessary, but they went along with it because they were commanded. They had a lot of laws like that. The corners of every field is to be left for the poor. Um, this one's my favorite. This is another cleanliness law, but the way that it's worded is funny, but it basically says that everyone must submerge themselves in moving water, not stagnant water. He's basically, the idea is delineating the difference between a pond and a river, right? So it has to be moving water until it's over your head. That's how you need to ritually wash that way for certain specific feast days. And those feast days happen at least once a month. And I'm like, okay, so basically, in other words, take a bath and wash your hair. Make sure your whole head gets wet, right? And do it in a river and not a pond. And this is funny to me because to this day, the Jewish people take all of these laws so literally. I'll show you in just a second. But the kosher food requirements were among these laws as well. There were laws about how to dispose of dead bodies. And they were basically just laws that kept people from getting sick. Some of them were unnecessary, obviously, they were cultural, but a lot of them were just like, okay, don't poop next to your house, wash your hands, take a bath, don't eat animals that live in their own poop, just different things like that, like fully cook your meals. And it's basically just cleanliness ideas in a lot of ways. But so as for that bath one goes, so I told you about the wording. So to this day, the devout Hasidic Jews, when they go to take these ritual baths, they're supposed to walk in the water. That's in the wording, okay? So they walk in the water. This bath has a hole right there and a hole on the other side, and it's continually moving water, okay? And so they're supposed to walk in, and then I guess they crouch down or whatever, and then they get their head wet, and then they can walk back out. Some of the baths will have stairs on one side, and then the bath, and then stairs on the other side to walk out. But it's because of the way that it's worded that they're like this, when really the intent was just take a bath and make sure you get your hair wet too. And as they go along, so the Hebrews had the law, and some of them are becoming conscious, but the way that he believes that we became conscious was through art, because that's abstract, through music, through poetry, and through those kinds of things. So as we were worshiping these gods and idols, we began to become really good at art. And that in itself kind of helped bridge the gap to make us more conscious, right? So we're making these idols, we're worshiping these idols and then after a while, these idols become idols of kings instead of gods. For a while there, in every civilization, the kings were gods. They merged. Even this picture, in the European culture, Constantine was was it Constantine? Or was it Charlemagne? Well, Constantine started it where he was the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. And so for a while, even in the Christian community, Jesus and the Pope, well, the Pope is kind of a stand-in, and the king was the Pope. And so in almost every culture, that kind of merged for a while. And then this is just pictures of kings, but it's artworks that we did. And then we started getting into architecture to build these really amazing buildings for our gods and for our idols, right? And that as we're doing that, we're becoming even more conscious. It's kind of he thinks it's an evolution thing, and epigenetics can kind of prove that could be true. That as we go, more and more people are becoming conscious, and a lot of this has to do with the art that we're creating. And then we create the music, which makes it even more complete, more abstract. We're merging the two hemispheres, bridging the gap. So at this point, the Holy Roman Emperor King is in power at this point, because this is like the epitome, this is the height of the God King. Right? Because the Pope is supposed to be the representative of God on this earth. The Catholic Church took a hold of the Christian religion early on and suppressed like any real expression of worshiping Jesus for a long time. There was a lot of worshiping of saints. There was a lot of worshiping of, it was twisted for a long time, and they kept people from really understanding what Jesus was about. You couldn't even read the Bible. It was all in Latin. And it was all about the hierarchy, and it was all about keeping the church in charge. And then at the epitome of, the Pope King, that changed everything. But first, this is kind of where I diverge on the theory a little bit from the author. He looks at this purely from an atheist evolutionist point of view. And I think that could be it, but I also think you could look at it from a spiritual point of view too. I think the theory works for both. But it does explain a lot of the human condition. It explains a lot of the strange practices we have with burial, with the obsession with the afterlife burials. It explains it explains the divine right of kingship. It explains a lot of our culture, in the past, and why it was so universal and why everybody did it and why we're not doing it anymore. It also, it explains why people still hear voices. It explains why, people had the divination of idols. It's why they were so obsessed with their kings and their gods. All of it. Now, I believe that God could have something to do with this, and that's why Jesus came. Because when Jesus came, it was kind of like the final integration of the consciousness. You no longer had to worship, you no longer had to use a stand-in to talk to your God. You're not going to hear God anymore. And a lot of people have made comments about how after Jesus came, no one heard God's voice anymore. And that's because, there's no more sacrifice to the gods. You don't have to do that for him to be a part of your life. It's kind of like you're not going to hear them anymore because he made the final sacrifice. You don't have to sacrifice to these dead gods because he's a living God. And under the new covenant, your God understands you and he forgives you. And it's kind of the last bit of integration of your gods into you, and it brings the hemispheres together. That's kind of what the work on the cross did. Now, it took a long time for it to really affect. I'm saying that's what happened, but it didn't really affect much right away. But this is messing with the divine right of kings. And remember, this was at the point of the God King. But if you no longer have the same need for that same God King, then that's going to mess with the power balance. And that's where the Catholic Church comes in. You notice those are keys. Now that's supposed to be from the Bible where it says, Paul was given the keys to the kingdom. But the Catholic Church took that to a whole nother level. The keys to the kingdom. No, it's the keys to everything. And that's why they worked so hard and still do to this day to keep people from having, really truly understanding what it means to be a Christian, to have Jesus in your heart. It's about that integration of God into yourself. Pope Francis has just a few years ago said that having a personal relationship with Jesus is harmful and dangerous because the Catholic Church believes that only the Pope can intercede for you, the Pope and also saints. The Catholic Church has always encouraged prayer to saints, but that's just another version of all these personal gods that people had. And then, of course, the corruption, the selling of indulgences, I can't think of a more corrupt organization, besides, I guess, some of them. But it's been around forever and it's still corrupt and it's probably worse than it's ever been today. But selling of forgiveness of your sins, when what Jesus taught is that he's the only, he will forgive your sins if you give them to him. There is no such thing as selling for your forgiveness, giving the Pope money or giving the church money and having them absolve you of your sin. That just isn't anywhere in the Bible. But they had a monopoly on this information. They had a monopoly because the Bible was only in Latin. And so what happened is the Reformation started. And these men, they decided to translate the Bible into all these different languages and teach people, what Jesus really was teaching. And this was right around the time of the first, what do you call it? The press, where they could reproduce books. Gosh, I can't even think of the name. But yeah, so the Gutenberg, where they could produce the Bible at a massive level and distribute it to people and translate them. And so this was the beginning of a whole new world. And the church didn't like it. And they responded with the Inquisition, with the burning of heretics and witches. And so once the Pope was canceled, what happened was that's when the Jesuits were formed. The Jesuits, the whole idea of their order is to support the Pope, to obey the Pope, and they were put together in order to stop the Reformation, to stop the Protestants from splitting off of the church. Now they failed, but they caused a lot of havoc and a lot of damage, and they're still out there trying to do it. And then, so as this is going on, and basically literacy rates are rising, more and more people are becoming conscious, and this is around the age of Enlightenment. And I've gone over a lot of this in another video, but that's when the formation of the Masons happened. And that whole all-knowing eye that started back in Egypt, it has to do with this, because back when you were hearing your gods, they were always watching you. And they were a part of you. They were part of who you were in your head. And that's what that all-knowing eye is about. And the Masons want to get back to that. And they want to have enlightenment or consciousness become something that is only given to people that are Masons, right? They want people to go back to the days where they listen to commands and do what they're told, unless you're one of the few enlightened. Now, that's what the Enlightenment was about, or what it was. And I don't think I think we're told so many wrong things about it, right? I think there's a lot of rewritten history, but that's what, like I said, when the Masons came, and see what happened is the church lost the power. The God King had become the king, and then now they were losing power. So the Masons came and they decided they wanted it. So they decided erase history, and they took out the kings. They took out the gods and the kings at the same, or they noticed the gods were going. And so I think the Jesuits did this because they didn't want the kings to be the ones who, became the new god. And so when they formed, after all of those revolutions, the French Revolution and the American Revolution being the major two, the whole basis of power was reformed on the idea of separation of church and state. But the thing is we're taught that that's good, right? That church and state should not be united, which is true. But what we miss, what we're not told, is that all that does is switch the power to the state. It takes the power from the church, and now it's in the state. It's no longer in the hands of kings. It's no longer in the hands of the church, and now it's in the hands of the Masonic kings, the many kings. And this is the Masonic, every single founder from for our country, every single person in the French Revolution, they're all Masons. And what they did is they did an overthrow in a way, and I think it was led by the Jesuits, and they took over, and now we have many kings. Instead of one king that leads everything, we have many as we elect them, which it gives us the illusion of choice, the illusion that we're in control. But all it does is solidify their power, because it's a lot harder to get rid of many kings than it is to get rid of a single bad king. So that's how the Masons kind of took over the world there. And it all is based on this idea of the merging of the two hemispheres for us to become conscious. There's a lot of people that are familiar with this with this theory, but they don't teach it really. A lot of people will read about it, but then they don't say anything in it. And it's another one of those gatekeeper things. Okay, this man mentions if Janus theories are right, he could become the Darwin of the mind. And now these theories aren't totally new. Freud, his idea of the id and the ego, he knew there was more than that a man could be of two minds. We've known this for a long time. Janus just cut together. Now, what does this mean? Do the Masons know all of this? Do they know this theory? I believe they've known it longer than Janus did. If you look at this patch, for instance, if you flip those threes around, or you flipped one of them around, it kind of looks like the brain, like one hemisphere of the brain. And the 33 is the merge of two hemispheres in the brain, and that's what enlightenment is. Now, we're all pretty sick of being the puppets, right? Now, if the Masons are aware of this merging of the brains and the enlightenment, then they have an edge on a lot of people. And if they've known it for longer, because not every person has became enlightened at the same time. And 300 years ago, when the Enlightenment happened, not every person had reached this level. Some people probably still haven't. The author thinks that that could be the reason behind suicide bombings. And what that means is that we are very open to suggestion. If we are of these two minds, and you could cover a person's eye whose brain is disconnected, and she could be doing something with her hand that her brain she doesn't know she's doing. I mean, we are very susceptible to suggestion, to mind control, to this whole whispering in our ear, more susceptible than anyone has ever taught us, because this is how we existed for thousands of years. Do we have free will, a choice to choose which road? Some of us have more capacity to assert free will than others. Many of us are just as happy to follow along with the crowd. It's this whole, we're still getting used to the idea that the gods aren't telling us what to do. So people have stepped in knowing that the gods aren't there anymore. If you don't control your mind, someone else will. You need to be in the driver's seat. Now, not everybody's ready for this, and that's the whole idea of what enlightenment is, like with the Masons. And I think that part of it, though, is their whole mystery that they put out there. They're trying to put out this illusion that there is a way, a path to this secret enlightenment when we have it already. We don't need to do secret rites. We don't need to do secret spells or alchemy or anything. The only thing that alchemy will bring you is more knowledge, because it's chemistry. But what we're taught is to be happy. That's what the world teaches us. The world doesn't teach us to think. We're taught, oh, just be happy. We've been screwed with what the new controllers have done to us with money, violence, drugs. We have just become so distracted, we've forgotten how to think. This is a typical version of what people feel today. I'm scared. Take happy pills. I love wine. Oh, help me. I need to be safe. Oh, but I love me, my body, me first. Trust science. Trust the experts. Don't use your brain. I mean, this is today, this is the epitome of virtue, what you're looking at. And it's the opposite of virtue in real life. We need to think, and it's okay to think. We can think. We need to trust ourselves. The best way to do that is to go out and do something. Do something for a better world. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It just means go forth. Have any of you ever listened to Jordan Peterson and his lectures about the Bible series? He mentions this, that the best virtue in life is to just go out and do. Invent something. Look at this. This is a harp. Someone from, I think 2,000 years ago put this together, carved it and made it. Why don't we do that anymore? We've lost our music. I mean, the music today is trash. The art today is trash. The architecture today is trash. Why aren't we doing this anymore? And we can do it at any point. You can. So that's what we need to do. We need to just go forth, learn music theory, invent something, build something, write something, film something, paint something, make something, create something. It doesn't matter. If you do that, your aura and your heart and your vibrations, and it will spill onto other people. It will spread. We need action is what we need today. We know that we're being suppressed, and what we need to do, instead of fighting against them and demanding for our rights, we need to just go and take them. Just go and do, create. That is the secret to the universe. The Christians call it living water. That means that when you're feeling one with the universe, basically with God, and you're around other people, living waters pour out from you, and you will affect the people around you. You will bring them up just by being in their presence, just because of your mindset, and the fact that you're integrated with yourself, the fact that you don't need, that you are the master of your being. And that's what this comes down to. And this theory, I suggest that you look it up yourself or buy the book. It's really amazing. But I really think there's something to it. And I think that the suppression of Christianity has a lot to do with why we're where we're at. And I do believe that during the Enlightenment era, there was a huge amount of history that was rewritten, and that the Masons that were in charge during that time, they are now our God kings. The state is what we worship now instead of the king. And now we just have many kings, because anybody who's in charge is a Mason. I mean, they're the ones that choose. And so we've just traded one evil for another. And we don't need, if we become fully integrated, we don't need these God kings anymore, whatever form that they take. And that's how we move on. That's how we get to the next level. That's how we get to the next place. And they're trying to stop it, and they're trying to bring us down with so many things, by squashing our freedoms in our education system and teaching us that everything's already been done, and trying to suppress thought, and mostly trying to suppress action, making people believe that they can't do things, that they just don't know how, or they're not able to. So we need to just break through that cage, and just go forth and take on the world. And it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't have to be important. You just have to create. You have to interact with this universe, make music, poetry, just do something. And I swear, if all of us take that mentality on, the world will just change by itself, without us even realizing it. It'll be a domino effect. And that 33 degrees Mason, that's the two hemispheres of the brain. And a 33-degree Mason is just, they know that the brains are merged. They know this. And they're trying to keep us from knowing. And they want to maintain power. They want to have a monopoly on enlightenment. But they can't. And if we don't let them, they won't. So that's my video for today. I love you guys. I hope that you listen to it. I hope that you take it seriously. Look up the book. I hope you liked it. And just God bless you, and have a wonderful day. And I'll talk to you later.